We're in 1 Kings chapter 15. I think Adam is handing out some sheets. Didn't get one. Again, remind everybody that next week's is out there too. If you want to go ahead and pick that up beforehand and kind of look over it, and makes for a lot better discussion when everybody takes part in it. In 1 Kings chapter 15, usually we start with a kind of a thought question to get us going down the right road. I couldn't think of a good one for this one, but while I was doing the lesson, I thought of a decent one, I guess. But we'll kind of use it to use as a springboard into the lesson itself. And the question involves the idea, are children destined to follow in the footprints of their parents? No. Is it the case that most children do follow in the footsteps of their parents?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. And what's interesting about, we're studying the kings of Israel and of Judah. You know, you have a lot of these kings who follow in the footsteps of their fathers. A lot of evil and a lot of wickedness involved in the hierarchy of both Israel and Judah. And it wasn't uncommon for the king's son to follow in his footsteps, but yet there were some rare instances in there where that did not happen, where there were good and noble and godly kings, even though their fathers and their grandfathers had been very wicked individuals. And so it's a concept that's worthy, I think, of at least reminding ourselves of that as we study this, that a child is not destined to walk in the footprints of their parents, whether that's good or whether that's evil. And some of these kings, again, we're going to study about. They're going to follow in the footsteps of their parents. Some are not. Okay, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 15 and get a volunteer here. Let's read the first 8 verses. All right, the first 2 kings we're going to study about were kings of Judah. And here we read about Abijam. Depends on what name you want to label him by, whether you read about him in the book of Kings or the book of Chronicles. He's called Abijam here in Kings and Abijah in the book of Chronicles. But he was a man who followed in the footsteps of his father. Anybody remember who would his father have been? I did good teaching that, didn't I? He was the son of Rehoboam, right? And Rehoboam was the son of who? Yeah, Solomon. All right. So he was the son of Rehoboam. His grandfather was Solomon. And so we're reading about him here. And even though Solomon, again, was a very wise man, he was a man who fortified the empire of Israel. Remember that Rehoboam had taken the treasury of the temple and owned the royal palace, and had actually used that to pay off the king of Egypt, keep him from basically taking over Israel. And so Rehoboam kind of wasted all those resources that Solomon had stored up. And so we're reading about his son here, Abijam. And so the question is, in what way was Abijam like his father? What kind of man was Rehoboam? Yeah, remember we had Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. We had Rehoboam in the southern. And we often talk about how wicked Jeroboam was, and he was an ungodly man, obviously setting up a false system of worship, but Rehoboam wasn't much better, was he? He's a very wicked, very evil individual. He worshipped idols. He served other gods, and of course a lot of the perverse practices involved in those religions were brought in to the southern kingdom under the reign of Rehoboam. So in what way was Abijam like his father?
Evil footsteps. I mean, he just followed in all the evil that is.
Yeah, that's kind of a cover-all statement, but it's a good one. I mean, he was evil and wicked, right? Did he worship idols? Was he engaged in idolatry? Absolutely. Did he lead people into sin? Did he encourage them to worship idols? Well, sure. Was his heart not fully devoted to God? Absolutely. Was he a king who was involved in constant warfare? Yeah. I mean, he was just like his father, wasn't he? In just about every way. Question number 2 is, so we read a little bit about David, a statement that's made from time to time. The life of David is interjected in the rule of a lot of these kings. But how did this, or God's commitment to David and David's commitment to God influence or help to shape the rest of Judah's history that we're going to read about? What really key change or element or theme do you see throughout the reign of Judah because of David?
If I'm understanding your questions, it's all it is his lineage. Is that what
Yeah,
you're saying?
that was the promise. Yeah, that was the promise that God made to David because of his faithfulness. Now remember that the kingdom was taken away. Solomon was unfaithful. He set up those idolatrous places to worship, and because of that, the 10 northern tribes were given to another king, but there was still going to be the southern part that would remain under the rule of David's descendants. And really, when you study the history, it wasn't because these were such good and godly men, but it was because of David's faithfulness to God. So God made David a promise because of his commitment to him. And I kind of think of it in the light of like Abraham, the promise that God made to Abraham. You know, through him would come this mighty nation and this great seed. Was Israel always good? No, the majority of the time they were evil and wicked people. But because of the faithfulness of Abraham and his commitment to God, God made him this promise. And the same is true with David. God had promised him a lamp, that is a dynasty, if you will, within that southern kingdom. And so he continues on, his lineage continues on, even though there's some very ungodly men. All right, the next man that we're going to read about, again, descendant of David here, and another king in Judah. And we're not going to read all these verses. We got 2 chapters to try to make it through tonight. I think I counted 8 different kings, so I'm not going to try to read all of it. But if I can, somebody will read verses 9 through 14 for us. We're going to read about Asa.
And in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, reigned Asa over Judah, and 41 years reigned he in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Micaiah, and a daughter of Abishalom. And Asa did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father, or as did David his father. And he took away the Sodomites out of the land, and removed all the idols that his father had made. And also Micaiah his mother, even her he removed from being queen, because she had made an idol in a grove. And Asa destroyed her idol and burned it by the brook of Kidron. But the high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was perfect with the Lord all his days.
Okay, so we read about one of those exceptions in the history of the kings where, a person had an evil and a wicked father and even an evil and wicked grandfather, but yet he turned out to be a righteous individual. And so Asa is one of those good kings of Judah. And the question number 3 here is, what was remarkable about Asa, when you consider the character of his father? Yeah, I mean, he lived a righteous and a productive life, and we kind of hit on it, in the beginning. It's not written in stone that a parent is always going to follow in the footsteps of their parents, or that a child is always going to follow in the footsteps of their parents, but it's generally the trend, isn't it? And so when you see somebody break that trend, You know, it's very unusual. But Asa was that man. You know, we read about a lot of the religious prostitutes that had been brought in, both male and female, under the worship of these different idols. And he did away with all of those. He removed how many of the idols that his forefathers had made? He removed every one of them, the Bible says. He removed all of them. All these places of worship, all these false idols that had been set up by his forefathers, he removed every one of them. And also, what's even impressive about him in question 4 here, how did he show that his own family wasn't exempt from God's standard of righteousness? Yeah. You know, when you read in the King James Version, a daughter or son, it doesn't always mean immediate. We're actually reading about his grandmother here that was removed from the office of being queen. And why was she removed? Yeah, she had this image made of this God and set up this system of worship. And, you know, just stop and think about that for a minute. How did you, or you know, if your grandmother's still alive, how did you or how do you interact with your grandmother? I mean, grannies were precious, weren't they? And can you imagine having to remove your own grandmother from being queen? I mean, that's just it shows that his priority was his love for God, not his love for his family. And there's a great lesson for us in that. First and foremost, our love has to be dedicated to God. Yes, sir.
Side question: what is but he did not remove high places if he destroyed all the idols?
Yeah. So remember, whenever we studied Solomon, we read about some of the places where he went and sacrificed. They were called high places, and they weren't specific places that God had designated for Israel to worship Him. But through the years, Israel had just made these places. And basically, they were places where Jehovah God was worshipped, but they weren't authorized places. And so I think that's what it's talking about here. The only thing that he didn't do is remove some of these unauthorized places. They were still places that God was worshipped. And obviously, in his zeal to remove idolatry, it says he did away with all the idolatrous worship. But they weren't authorized places. And so, again, Gibeah, I think, was one of those places where Solomon went on a regular occasion and offered sacrifices and burnt offerings. But that was the one area in which, you know, if you could describe, I wouldn't describe his life as a failure, but that was the one area in which he should have produced zeal, but certainly didn't. So, these high places where God was worshipped, he kept those. And again, we're not going to read all the story of Asa, but does anybody remember another thing that he did that kind of led to, well, at least the disapproval of God?
Verse 18, he took all the silver and gold and went to the treasury.
Yeah. So, you know, he was a godly man, but he had a league that he made with, who was it, the king of Syria, I think? Anyway, he made a league with him. And so, instead of turning to God and trusting in God, you know, he took all this, again, emptied the treasury, right? Built it back up. He restored all those things. Remember, his father or his grandfather, I guess, Rehoboam, had taken all of it out, and he kind of restored all that treasury. But then he got into a situation where he felt like he needed some help, and he turned to men instead of to God. And you can read the rest of that story in the book of 1 Chronicles. It's recorded there in more detail. Wish we had time to go through all these, but we don't. And God actually sent a prophet to him and condemned him, you know, for doing such, for trusting in men, not trusting in him. So that was part of one of his weaknesses and one of the negative things about his life. The question in number 5 is, you know, that's not uncommon as a human being. I think as humans, we're often prone to turn toward human sources in order to find help instead of turning to God. Why do you think that's the case? You know, usually if a person has a problem, what would you say is the first thing we try to do? Ourselves, right? That's the first person we turn to. And if we can't fix it, then what do? Yeah, we turn to somebody else, right? We think, well, maybe this person can help me. And usually when you think about where God is on the list, he's way down here at the bottom, isn't he? And that was the condemnation here of Asa. You know, instead of turning to God first, he turned to men. And so, again, another good lesson for us in that. But I think it's just human nature. You know, we could say maybe pride. You know, maybe we want to be able to fix things ourselves. Sometimes it's just failure to trust in God, isn't it? Failure to believe in God. And so different reasons why we might do that. All right, let's go to verse 25 here in 1 Kings 15, and somebody read 25 through 31 for us.
And Nadab the son of Jeroboam began to reign over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned over Israel 2 years. Did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in his sin wherever he made Israel to sin. And Baasha the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar conspired against him, and Baasha smote him at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, for Nadab and all Israel laid siege to Gibbethon. Even in the third year of Asa, king of Judah, did Baasha slay him and reigned in his stead. And it came to pass when he reigned, that he smote all the house of Jeroboam, and left not to Jeroboam any that breathed until he had destroyed them, according unto the saying of the Lord, which he spake by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. Because of the sins of Jeroboam which he sinned, in which he made Israel sin by his provocation, wherewith he provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger. Now the rest of the acts of Nadab, and all that he did, are not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel.
Okay, so the first two kings that we've studied about have been the kings of Judah, or kings of the southern kingdom. And so now we switch to a northernly view. We're switching to the kings of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. And the first one that we read about here is Nadab. And who was Nadab? Who was his father?
Jeroboam.
Yeah, Jeroboam. And remember, we studied Jeroboam, and he was the one who set up the false system of worship to keep people from going back to Jerusalem, because he was afraid they were going to go back. Their heart was going to turn back to Rehoboam and the southern kingdom. What prophecy do you remember was pronounced upon him? Go ahead.
Well, his seed we wiped out.
Yeah, remember, because of what he had done, remember his son fell sick, and he tried to disguise his wife, send him to the prophet Ahijah, and Ahijah said, I've got a message from God for Jeroboam, and this is that his lineage, his descendants are going to be wiped out. Every male in his house, whether it's a servant, whether it's a free man, they're going to die. And so we read about Nadab. He's next in line. He's after Jeroboam. He's his son, and he only got to reign for 2 years. And what happened to him? Yeah, Baasha rose up against him and killed him. And what else did he do to ensure that he would never be king again?
Wiped out all of his
Yeah.
descendants.
Yeah, you know, we read about these sometimes, and seems pretty brutal among God's people for something like that to happen. But that was the way of the ungodly people of that day and age. You know, he was just copying the example of those around him. And so if you wanted to ensure that you were going to be king, you got to get rid of all the competition. And that's what he did. He fulfilled the prophecy that was given against Jeroboam by killing all the male descendants of his household. So question number 6 here, you don't read a lot about, again, Nadab. You read mainly about Baasha, right, rising up against him. But it's kind of an interesting thought. What do you think determines whether a rebel inside a government is more successful than the person that he or she overthrows? All right, we read about it, we hear about it in not necessarily in our own land, but in other countries, where somebody will rebel against the leadership or the government of that country and overthrow them. And so what do you think are some of the things that determine whether that person who's rebelled has been or is successful or not?
Get rid of the competition.
Okay. Whether he has competition or not, right? If you're the only one, that kind of locks it in for you. And so, again, you read this, it seems brutal, but it wasn't uncommon in that day and age. Any other things that might contribute to it?
Usually if a place is doing well and he's well liked, the people won't stand for you taking that leader out that went poorly for you. If
Yeah.
they're really bad and hate the guy, you probably got a pretty good shot. But in this case, it was determined by God who was going to do it,
Yeah.
who was going to succeed.
So you got two birds with one stone there, right? One of the things that pops into my mind is, how well did the people react to Nadab being king? Well, I don't read anything where they lost any sleep whenever he was replaced by somebody else. And so, generally, if you're doing well, your country's doing well economically, socially, then the leader's going to be liked. If they're not, then they're probably not going to be that favorite among the people. And the real thing is, like Adam said, this happened why? Was God on Nadab's side? No. And so it happened because this was the judgment of God. And again, you have this concept throughout the scripture, God's in control in the kingdoms of men. These men had the opportunity to change the culture and to influence the people for good. And when they didn't, God removed them. God replaced them with somebody else. And so we read about Baasha taking over. All right, let's read some more about him. You can read a couple things there at the end of chapter 15. But let's go over to chapter 16. And somebody read chapter 16 and verses 1 through 7 for us.
What did you say, 1 Kings 16?
Did I say 15?
I think you said 16.
Okay. I meant 16, whatever I said. 16, 1 through 7, yeah.
Then the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hananiah, against Baasha, saying, Inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust and made you ruler over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam, and have made my people Israel sin, and provoked me to anger with their sins, surely I will take away the posterity of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. The dogs shall eat whatever belongs to Baasha and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whatever dies in the fields. Now the rest of the acts of Baasha, what he did, and his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? So Baasha rested with his fathers and was buried in Tirzah. Then Eli, his son, reigned in his place. And also the word of the Lord came by the prophet Jehu, the son of Hananiah, against Baasha and his house, because of all the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger with the work of his hands, and being like the house of Jeroboam, and because he killed him.
Okay, so we read a little bit about Baasha's reign. He reigned over the northern kingdom for 24 years. So he had a pretty lengthy reign. What was Jeroboam? Was it 22? For some reason that pops in my mind. I think he was somewhere around that area, about 22 years. His son reigned 2 years, and then you have Baasha who reigned for 24 years. What kind of man was Baasha? Yeah, he was just like Jeroboam, wasn't he? And so what pronouncement did God put upon him?
Same thing as Jeroboam's household.
Yeah, basically God says if you're going to act like Jeroboam, what happened to him is going to happen to you too. And so he didn't show any favoritism toward one person or the other, but certainly the punishment that was going to be brought upon Baasha was deserved. So all of his male descendants were going to be cut off too. So he would no longer be king. Again, you see this idea where God gives a man an opportunity, to change and to try to turn the nation around. When he doesn't do what he's supposed to do, then God replaces him with somebody else. Why didn't that happen in Judah? Well, we read about it earlier because of the faithfulness of David. God had made a covenant with David, and because of his faithfulness, he was always going to have a descendant within that office of kingship. So he followed down the same road. He walked down the same road that Jeroboam walked down. His fate was going to be the same. That tells you a little bit too about, I know sometimes people say, well, why did God allow him to murder, all the descendants of Jeroboam? Well, do you think God approved of that? Yeah, read verse 7 there. It was because he murdered, who am I thinking of? Because he murdered Nadab? Yeah, Nadab. And all the descendants is why this judgment was brought upon him. So God didn't approve of the way that he became king, but certainly he allowed him for that process to take place and allowed him to occupy that office. All right, so the next guy, let's go down to, somebody read verses 8 through 14 for us.
In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Eli, the son of Baasha, became king over Israel at Tirzah and reigned 2 years. His servant Zimri, commander of all his chariots, conspired against him. Now he was at Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Horizon, who was over the household of Tirzah. Then Zimri went in and struck him and put him to death in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and became king in his place. It came about when he became king, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he killed all the household of Baasha. He did not leave a single male, neither of his relatives nor of his friends. Then Zimri destroyed all the household of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke against Baasha through Jehu the prophet. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Eli his son, which he had sinned, and which they made Israel sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Eli and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel?
Okay, so you read about Elah, who was Bala's son. Again, very short reign, 2 years that he reigned. His servant Zimri, commander of half of his chariots or half of his army, he actually rebelled against him. And of course, one night or one day, Elah was drinking himself. He was in such a drunken stupor that Zimri killed him. And not only did he kill him, but he again went and wiped out all the male descendants. And so again, you have another prophecy of God that's fulfilled. Part of the question here in number 8 is, why do you think God takes it so seriously? It's not just that these kings were evil and wicked people, but they encouraged other people to do that, and they led them down that road. Why do you think God takes that so seriously? Okay, yeah, it violates the idea of treating others, like we would treat ourselves. And so when you think about the idea of deliberately leading somebody astray, even in the New Testament, Jesus spoke about the concept in Matthew 18 and verse 6. He said, "But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depth of the sea." That sounds pretty brutal, doesn't it? But there were two millstones, two different Greek words that were used for millstone in that day and age. One of them had to do with basically a hand millstone that a woman would use to grind the grain. And then there was a giant millstone that was often used by animals, where they would tie the stick on that stone and they would walk around and it would grind the grain. Jesus used the giant. So he says, better for this giant millstone to be tied around your neck. Of all the ways that you could die, I mean, what are some of the worst ways that you could think of that you could die? Drowning would be one. Burning, I wouldn't want to burn to death either. It's the idea of the worst death that a person could experience. So Jesus is talking about a person who would deliberately lead somebody else astray, right? And so you read about that concept. God takes it very, very seriously, because what kind of person would deliberately lead another person into eternal destruction? I mean, that's a hard-hearted and wicked person, isn't it? And so a lot of these things that happen to these kings happen, and they're like Jeroboam. They knew better. I mean, they knew exactly what they were doing, but they just went ahead and did it anyway for selfish ambition and worldly gain. And so there's a bad fate awaiting those people who would deliberately lead others to eternal destruction. We read about, we don't have a whole lot of time left. I didn't know how far we would get, but remember Zimri kills him and wipes out all his descendants, and his reign lasts all of 7 days. And after all the people hear that he's killed Elah and wiped out all of the king's descendants, they appoint Omri as their king. And so he goes, and there's a fight, lasted about 7 days, and when Zimri sees he's not going to be able to prevail, he locks himself in the king's palace and burns the palace down on top of him. And so that's the way that he died. And what you'll see in all these, are these kings dying these violent deaths. What's the cause of all that? Sin, it's the consequences and because of the actions of sin that have taken place, that all these terrible things are happening to these kings and to these kingdoms. And so Zimri commits suicide. You have Omri who begins a reign. He was a pretty powerful king of the northern kingdom. In fact, there's a lot, I think, in Phoenician history and a couple of other places in some major battles that he took. Militarily, he was a pretty competitive guy. And so he reigned over Israel, but you read about, he walked in the footsteps of Jeroboam. So he didn't militarily, he was good for the kingdom, but spiritually speaking, he didn't do anything to improve that. And the last king that we read about is one that we're going to read about throughout the rest of the book of 1 Kings, and that is Ahab. And let's read about him, kind of set the tone for studying him. Somebody read verses 29 through 34 here, 1 Kings 16.
In the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took the wife of Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there. Okay, he rang the bell on us, but it kind of gives you an idea of the type of person that Ahab was. He followed in the steps of Jeroboam. He set a new record when it came to evil, and part of that had to do with the woman that he married. Remember who he married? Yeah, Jezebel, and she was on fire for Baal worship. I mean, she hated the worship of Jehovah God, and I think she helped provoke him more than anybody to try to set up all these idols and these false systems of worship and destroy anyone, and especially the prophets that would stand up for Jehovah. So that's the guy we're going to read about for the rest of our study about a lot, and it's not because of all the great contributions that he made to the kingdom, but it's because of all the evil influence that he exerted upon both the northern and the southern kingdom. So, crash course in 8 Kings. Anybody got any comments or questions or anything before we end?